At 6:28 a.m. on June 6, 1944, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. stepped off Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel number 15 into the cold waters of the English Channel, 50 yards from Utah Beach, Normandy, France. The water temperature was 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The 56-year-old general, eldest son of President Theodore Roosevelt, carried a walking stick carved from olive wood in his left hand and a standard-issue Colt M1911A1 .45 caliber pistol in his right. He wore a standard infantry uniform with no special markings beyond his single-star rank insignia on his helmet. He had specifically requested no distinguishing features. German snipers targeted officers. Roosevelt's uniform was identical to every other soldier's except for that single star. Behind him, 10,000 men of the 4th Infantry Division prepared to storm the most heavily fortified coastline in Nazi-occupied Europe. The division had been training for this moment for 18 months. They'd practiced amphibious landings on the beaches of Devon, England, 47 separate times. They'd studied aerial reconnaissance photographs of Utah Beach until every man could identify bunkers, obstacles, and defensive positions from memory. They'd rehearsed coordination with naval gunfire support, with Army Air Force bombers, with paratroopers who would drop inland hours before the beach assault. Everything had been planned to the minute, to the yard, to the individual soldier's responsibility. But Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. had a problem that no amount of planning could solve. Army medical boards had declared him physically unsuitable for command 3 separate times between 1940 and 1943. His medical file, stored at Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C., was 147 pages long. It documented rheumatoid arthritis in both knees, a heart condition diagnosed as arteriosclerotic heart disease with left ventricular hypertrophy, chronic malaria contracted during an expedition to Brazil in 1913, and a speech impediment classified as severe developmental stuttering with secondary cluttering behavior. The speech impediment had defined his life. Medical records from Roosevelt's childhood, preserved in the Theodore Roosevelt Collection at Harvard University, documented his first stuttering episode at age 7 in 1894. His father, then police commissioner of New York City, noted in his personal diary, "Ted cannot complete sentences without severe blocking. The boy's mind works faster than his tongue can follow. He grows frustrated, then angry at his own inability to communicate. 3 tutors have tried to help. None have succeeded." By 1901, when Theodore Roosevelt Sr. became president following William McKinley's assassination, 14-year-old Theodore Jr.'s stutter had become more severe. White House staff documented instances where the boy couldn't speak for 90 seconds or longer when stressed. His father hired 4 separate speech therapists. 2 were from Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. 1 was from Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. 1 was a private practitioner from Vienna, Austria, who claimed revolutionary treatment methods. None succeeded in eliminating the stutter. Theodore Jr. developed coping mechanisms. He learned to pause before speaking, giving his brain time to organize words before attempting articulation. He practiced difficult phrases repeatedly in private until they became automatic. He avoided certain consonant combinations that triggered blocks. He substituted synonyms for words he knew would cause problems, but these mechanisms required conscious effort and preparation. Under sudden stress, they failed. Under extreme stress, they failed catastrophically. At Harvard University, where Theodore Jr. enrolled in 1905, classmates mocked his inability to answer professors' questions without stuttering. One professor, whose name was preserved in university disciplinary records, told Roosevelt in front of the entire class, "Mr. Roosevelt, perhaps you should consider a career that doesn't require verbal communication. Have you thought about library science?" The comment was meant as a joke. Students laughed. Roosevelt didn't return to that class for 2 weeks, but Roosevelt refused to let the stutter define him. He joined the Harvard Crimson newspaper, writing articles instead of speaking. He joined the football team, where communication happened through plays memorized in advance. He joined the rifle team, where performance was measured in marksmanship, not words. He graduated in 1909 with honors, proving that his mind was capable even when his mouth wasn't. In 1917, when the United States entered World War I, 30-year-old Theodore Roosevelt Jr. volunteered for officer training. His father had been advocating for American intervention for 2 years. When war came, every Roosevelt man was expected to serve. Theodore Sr. had tried to raise a volunteer division to fight in France. The Wilson administration refused, so the Roosevelt sons would serve in the regular army instead. Theodore Jr. reported to the officer candidate school at Plattsburgh Barracks, New York, on May 8, 1917. Evaluation began immediately. Candidates were assessed on physical fitness, tactical knowledge, leadership potential, and ability to give clear verbal commands under stress. Roosevelt excelled at everything except the last category. Evaluation reports from May 1917, now stored at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, documented the problem. Candidate Roosevelt demonstrates excellent tactical understanding and physical courage. However, his severe speech impediment renders him unsuitable for command positions requiring clear verbal orders under stress. During simulated combat scenarios, candidate experienced speech blocks lasting 15-30 seconds when required to give immediate orders. This creates unacceptable operational risk. Recommendation: deny commission. Theodore Roosevelt Sr., still wielding considerable political influence, despite being out of office since 1909, personally contacted Secretary of War Newton Baker. The exact content of that conversation wasn't recorded, but the result was clear. Theodore Jr. received a second evaluation. He failed again. Same reason: speech impediment incompatible with command requirements. President Theodore Roosevelt contacted Secretary Baker directly. On July 12, 1917, Theodore Jr. received his commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army over the explicit objections of his evaluators. He deployed to France in June 1918 with the 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. His battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hanson Ely, later wrote, "I was ordered to accept Roosevelt as a platoon leader. I objected. I'd read his evaluation. I expected him to get men killed through inability to communicate under fire. I was wrong. Roosevelt never stuttered once in combat. Not once. I don't understand how, but under fire, his voice was clear, his orders were precise, and his men followed him into hell." Roosevelt led his platoon through the Battle of Cantigny in May 1918, the first major American offensive of the war. He led them through the Aisne-Marne offensive in July 1918. He led them through the Meuse-Argonne offensive in September 1918. He was wounded twice, gassed once, and promoted to lieutenant colonel by November 1918. His final efficiency report, written by Brigadier General Frank Parker, stated, "Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt is one of the finest combat leaders in the American Expeditionary Force. Whatever speech difficulties he may have experienced in training, they have never manifested in combat. Recommended for promotion to colonel and brigade command." But after the war ended, the Army's institutional memory returned. In 1919, Roosevelt requested a regular Army commission. Medical boards reviewed his record. They saw the speech impediment notation from 1917. They denied his application. Previous documented speech defect creates liability for peacetime command positions. Roosevelt returned to civilian life. For 21 years, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. worked in business, served in the New York State Assembly, and in 1932 he served as Governor General of the Philippines. But when World War II began in Europe in 1939, Roosevelt, now 52 years old, requested return to active duty. In June 1940, at age 53, he reported to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, for medical evaluation and possible commission. Army medical boards conducted a thorough examination. The results documented in his service record were devastating. Candidate presents with severe arteriosclerotic heart disease, rheumatoid arthritis in both knees requiring use of walking stick, history of malaria with recurring symptoms, and documented severe speech impediment. Candidate is physically unsuitable for any command position. Recommendation: deny commission. Roosevelt appealed. His brother Kermit was already serving in the British Army in North Africa. His sons, Quentin II and Cornelius, were preparing to enlist. The Roosevelt family tradition demanded service. On September 23, 1940, Roosevelt's appeal was denied with additional notation. Candidate's speech impediment, documented in World War I evaluations, renders him unsuitable for positions requiring verbal command authority under stress. This is a permanent disqualifying condition. Roosevelt used every contact he had. He wrote to Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall. He wrote to Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He wrote to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, his distant cousin, with whom he'd had a complicated political relationship. The responses were sympathetic but consistent. The medical board's decisions were based on objective medical criteria. A speech impediment that prevented clear communication under stress was a legitimate disqualifying condition for combat command. Finally, in April 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt received a commission as a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserve with assignment to logistics and supply. Not combat command, not infantry, logistics. He would coordinate supply chains, manage warehouses, process requisitions. The Army would use his organizational skills while keeping him away from situations requiring verbal combat command. Roosevelt accepted the assignment, but he never stopped requesting transfer to combat units. In December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, he requested combat assignment. Denied. Speech impediment incompatible with combat leadership. In March 1942, he requested assignment to North Africa. Denied. Same reason. In July 1942, he requested assignment to the Pacific Theater. Denied. Same reason. By late 1942, Roosevelt had submitted 11 separate requests for combat assignment. All denied, all citing his speech impediment as primary disqualifying factor. Then, in February 1943, Major General Raymond Barton assumed command of the 4th Infantry Division. Barton had served with Roosevelt in World War I. He'd seen Roosevelt under fire. He'd heard Roosevelt give orders in combat. He knew the official evaluations were wrong. When Roosevelt requested assignment to 4th Infantry Division as Assistant Division Commander, Barton didn't immediately refuse. Instead, he met with Roosevelt privately at Fort Benning, Georgia, on March 8, 1943. The conversation, later documented in Barton's personal papers, went like this. "Ted, you know what the medical boards say about your stutter. You know what the regulations require. I need assistant division commanders who can give immediate verbal orders under the worst conditions imaginable. Can you do that? Can you give me your absolute word that your stutter won't interfere with command?" Roosevelt's response: "Raymond, I stuttered my way through Harvard. I stuttered my way through officer candidate school. I never stuttered once in combat in 1918. I can't explain why, but under fire, the stutter disappears. Give me one chance. If I hesitate once, if I stutter once during training or combat, I'll resign the commission immediately. You have my word." Barton thought for 7 minutes, then said, "One chance. You hesitate once, you're gone." On April 15, 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt Jr. reported to 4th Infantry Division at Fort Benning. He was promoted to Brigadier General on May 2, 1943. He began training immediately. For 6 months, Roosevelt participated in every training exercise. He commanded battalions during field problems. He directed artillery support during live fire exercises. He coordinated with naval gunfire support during amphibious landing rehearsals. Training observers monitored him constantly, waiting for the stutter that medical boards had declared a permanent disqualifying condition. It never appeared. Not once in 6 months of high-stress training did Roosevelt stutter during command situations. Major General Barton began to trust him. By November 1943, Barton considered Roosevelt his most reliable assistant division commander. When 4th Infantry Division received orders to prepare for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, Barton assigned Roosevelt to coordinate the division's landing plans for Utah Beach. Utah Beach was the westernmost of 5 landing beaches in the Normandy invasion plan. The beach stretched 3 miles along the Cotentin Peninsula coast. German defenders had fortified it with concrete bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests, minefields, and beach obstacles designed to destroy landing craft. Intelligence estimated 2,500 German troops defended the immediate beach area, with 12,000 more within 12 miles who could reach the beach within 6 hours. The 4th Infantry Division would land 23,250 men in 23 successive waves, beginning at 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944. If they couldn't establish a beachhead within 12 hours, German reinforcements would drive them back into the sea. 23,250 American lives depended on the landing plan being executed perfectly. Roosevelt studied every detail. He memorized beach gradients, tidal patterns, German defensive positions, planned naval gunfire targets, Army Air Force bombing schedules, causeway locations, assembly areas, and inland objectives. He attended 43 separate planning meetings between November 1943 and May 1944. He reviewed aerial reconnaissance photographs daily. He interviewed paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions who would drop inland behind Utah Beach hours before the seaborne assault. He coordinated with Navy beachmasters who would direct landing craft to specific beach sectors. He ensured every detail was perfect. But in late May 1944, Roosevelt made an unusual request. He asked General Barton for permission to land with the first assault wave on Utah Beach. Barton refused immediately. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower had issued explicit orders. No general officers in first assault waves. Generals were too valuable, too knowledgeable about overall invasion plans. If captured, they could be forced to reveal strategic information. The risk was unacceptable. Roosevelt argued that first-wave troops would face the worst conditions. They would land under the heaviest fire. They would encounter unexpected obstacles. They would need immediate leadership from someone who understood the entire plan, someone who could make real-time decisions without waiting for orders from ships offshore. That someone should be a general officer who'd memorized every detail of the landing plan. That someone should be him. Barton refused. Roosevelt wrote a formal request to Eisenhower on May 23, 1944. The letter, preserved in Eisenhower's papers at the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library, stated, "The men of the 4th Infantry Division will land on a hostile shore under heavy fire. They will face obstacles, resistance, and confusion. They deserve to see their general officer beside them, not giving orders from a ship offshore. My age and physical condition are advantages. If a 56-year-old man with a walking stick and a heart condition can land with the first wave, every 19-year-old private will know that anyone can do it. Request permission to accompany first assault wave, Utah Beach, H hour." Eisenhower denied the request on May 24th. Roosevelt wrote again on May 25th. Denied. He wrote again on May 27th. Denied. He wrote again on May 29th. Denied. He wrote again on June 1st. Denied. He wrote a 6th request on June 2, 1944, 4 days before D-Day. This time, he added a personal note. "I may not survive this war. My heart condition makes that probable. But I can choose where I die. I choose to die beside my men, if that's to be my fate, not watching from a ship while they die on a beach. Grant me this one request." On June 3, 1944, Eisenhower reluctantly approved. He added a note to Roosevelt's file. "Approval granted against my better judgment and in violation of standing orders. General Roosevelt is 56 years old with documented heart disease. Medical staff estimates his chances of surviving the landing and subsequent combat at less than 50%. If he dies, the responsibility is his own. Army medical staff at the 4th Infantry Division Forward Headquarters reviewed Roosevelt's medical file one final time on June 4, 1944. The chief medical officer, Colonel Albert Schwartz, spoke to Roosevelt privately. The conversation, documented in Schwartz's post-war memoir, included this exchange. "General, your heart condition is severe. Arteriosclerotic disease with ventricular hypertrophy. You've had at least one heart attack in 1942. The physical stress of landing under fire, the emotional stress of combat command, the exertion of moving across a beach under load, all of these will put extreme strain on your cardiovascular system. Sir, you could have a heart attack on the beach. You could die before you even reach the seawall. Is this worth the risk?" Roosevelt's response: "Doctor, I'm 56 years old. Average life expectancy for American men is 64 years. I've lived a full life. I've been Governor General of the Philippines. I've served in one world war. I have 4 children who've made me proud. If I die on Utah Beach leading my men, that's a death worth having. If I die 10 years from now in a hospital bed, that's a death wasted. I'm landing with the first wave. Can a 56-year-old general with a stutter, a heart condition, arthritis, and a walking stick lead 10,000 men through the largest amphibious invasion in history? Can a man who's been declared medically unfit for command 3 separate times prove that leadership isn't about physical perfection? Please like this video to see how this turns out. Subscribe for more unlikely heroes who changed history, and let's continue back to Roosevelt on Utah Beach. At 6:28 a.m. on June 6, 1944, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. stepped off LCV P-15 into the English Channel 50 yards from Utah Beach. The water was 58 degrees. He was carrying approximately 50 pounds of equipment, including his walking stick, pistol, ammunition, map case, binoculars, compass, field radio, and personal medical kit. Behind him, 20 men from the 8th Infantry Regiment followed him off the landing craft. They were part of the first assault wave, scheduled to land at 6:30 a.m. They were 2 minutes early. Roosevelt waded through chest-deep water toward the beach. Waves crashed over his head. The weight of his equipment pulled him down. His walking stick provided stability on the uneven ocean floor. After 40 seconds, his feet touched sand. The water became shallower. He could see the beach ahead through morning mist and smoke from naval bombardment. Gray sand stretched 200 yards to a seawall. Beyond the seawall, dunes and German defensive positions. The beach was supposed to be Tear Green Sector, designated landing zone for 8th Infantry Regiment, 1st Battalion. Roosevelt had memorized every detail of Tear Green Sector. He knew where the German bunkers were. He knew where the beach obstacles were. He knew which causeways led inland. He knew everything about Tear Green Sector. But this wasn't Tear Green Sector. Roosevelt could see that immediately. The church steeple that should have been visible 800 yards inland wasn't there. The distinctive road junction that marked the inland edge of Tear Green Sector wasn't visible. The beach obstacles were in the wrong positions. The German bunkers were in the wrong locations. Everything was wrong. Naval coxswains had miscalculated tidal currents. Strong currents running parallel to shore had pushed landing craft south. Instead of landing at Tear Green Sector, the first wave had landed approximately 2,000 yards south at Victor Sector. This was catastrophic. The entire invasion plan was based on landing at specific beaches with pre-planned artillery support, pre-identified German positions, and pre-designated inland objectives. Landing at the wrong beach meant none of that planning applied. No artillery support was registered for Victor Sector. German defensive positions hadn't been identified. Inland objectives were different. Maps were wrong. 10,000 men were about to land with obsolete intelligence and no proper fire support. Standard military doctrine was clear. When landing at the wrong beach, withdraw immediately and re-land at the correct position. But withdrawal would take time. Landing craft would have to return to the transport ships. Ships would have to reposition. Landing craft would have to reload and return to shore. The entire process would take 4 to 6 hours minimum. By then, German reinforcements from the 91st Air Landing Division and 709th Infantry Division would have reached the coast. The element of surprise would be lost. German artillery would have registered firing coordinates on the beach. The second landing would face far heavier resistance than the first. Casualties would be catastrophic. Roosevelt had approximately 12 minutes before the second wave arrived, carrying 600 more men. He needed to make a decision: withdraw and re-land at the correct beach, following standard doctrine, or proceed inland from this location with no proper planning and no artillery support. His executive officer, Colonel James Van Fleet, splashed up beside him. Van Fleet had landed 30 seconds after Roosevelt. He'd also immediately recognized they were in the wrong location. Van Fleet said, "General, we're at least 2,000 yards south of planned position. Orders?" Roosevelt's stutter had been severe since age 7. Medical records documented episodes where he couldn't speak for 60-90 seconds under stress. Evaluators in 1917 had declared him unfit for command because his speech impediment rendered him incapable of giving clear verbal orders under pressure. This was exactly the scenario they'd predicted. Unexpected situation, extreme stress, life or death decisions required, immediate verbal orders necessary. This was the moment where his stutter should have paralyzed him. Roosevelt spoke clearly, without hesitation. "We're in the wrong place, but this is where we're starting. Notify all incoming waves. We'll start the war from right here." 9 words. "We'll start the war from right here." 9 words that would become one of the most famous quotes of D-Day. 9 words delivered without a single stutter, without a single hesitation, under the worst stress imaginable. Colonel Van Fleet later wrote in his after-action report, "General Roosevelt's voice was absolutely clear. No hesitation, no uncertainty, no speech impediment whatsoever. His orders were immediate and precise. But those 9 words were just the beginning." German artillery began firing at 6:33 a.m., 3 minutes after the first wave landed. 80 mm shells from German positions 2,000 yards inland started impacting the beach. The first shell exploded 60 yards from Roosevelt's position, throwing up a geyser of sand and seawater 50 feet high. The blast wave knocked 3 soldiers down. One man, Private Robert Mackenzie from Ohio, was hit by shrapnel and died within 90 seconds. He was the first American killed on Utah Beach. Roosevelt needed to organize the beach immediately. 300 men from the first wave were spreading across the sand, confused about their location, looking for leadership. German machine gun fire from positions 400 yards inland was raking the beach. MG-42 machine guns firing 1,200 rounds per minute created interlocking fields of fire across the entire beach. Soldiers were dropping into shell craters for cover. Some were frozen in fear. Some were advancing toward the seawall. There was no organization, no coordination, no clear command structure, and the second wave, carrying 600 more men, would arrive in 10 minutes. Roosevelt raised his voice above the sound of artillery and machine gun fire. He gave verbal orders. 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry, move inland 200 yards to the seawall, establish defensive positions. 2nd Battalion, secure the causeway exits. Engineers, begin clearing beach obstacles immediately. Medical teams, establish aid station 50 yards behind the seawall. Naval liaison, redirect naval gunfire to grid coordinates 847-423. All units, ignore the original landing plan. We're improvising from right here. 108 words, delivered in approximately 30 seconds, under German artillery and machine gun fire, with soldiers dying around him, without a single stutter, not one hesitation. Every word clear, precise, and immediately understood. Troops began moving. 1st Battalion advanced to the seawall. Engineers ran toward beach obstacles, carrying Bangalore torpedoes to clear paths through the obstacles. Medical teams established a casualty collection point. Naval liaison officers began calling fire missions to ships offshore. The second wave arrived at 6:42 a.m. 6 landing craft carrying approximately 600 men from the 8th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Battalion. They landed in the wrong location, just like the first wave, because they were following the first wave's landing pattern. But unlike the first wave, which landed in confusion, the second wave saw Roosevelt standing at the waterline, clearly visible with his walking stick, giving orders. Roosevelt met them at the waterline. "Welcome to France," Roosevelt said to the battalion commander, Major Carlton McElroy. "We're 2,000 yards south of planned position. Good news. German defenses here are lighter than at Tear Green. Bad news. We have no artillery support registered for this beach. We're going inland through causeways 1 and 2. Follow the engineers through the cleared paths. Watch for mines. Get your men off this beach in the next 10 minutes before German artillery finds our range. Move." 86 words in 25 seconds. Clear, immediate, comprehensive orders covering the tactical situation, the threat, and the solution. Major McElroy later stated in his after-action report, "General Roosevelt's orders were the clearest I've ever received. No confusion, no ambiguity, just exactly what needed to be done and exactly how to do it. I didn't know about his supposed stutter. If he has one, he never showed it on Utah Beach." German artillery was intensifying. 105mm rounds were now impacting the beach in addition to the 88mm fire. These were larger shells with larger blast radius and more shrapnel. At 6:47 a.m., a 105mm round exploded 40 yards from Roosevelt's position. The blast threw him to the ground. Shrapnel whistled overhead. One fragment hit his walking stick, splintering the handle. Another fragment tore through his uniform sleeve, grazing his left arm, but not penetrating deep enough to require medical attention. Roosevelt stood up, brushed sand off his uniform, and continued giving orders. The third wave was approaching. 6 more landing craft carrying 600 men. Roosevelt walked back to the waterline to meet them. Over the next 11 hours, Roosevelt would meet 23 separate landing waves personally. Each wave brought 400 to 600 men who needed immediate orders, immediate direction, immediate leadership. The men landing after the first few waves knew they were in the wrong location because they'd been briefed on the ships, but they didn't know what to do about it. They looked for leadership from officers on the beach. Roosevelt provided that leadership through continuous verbal commands. Wave 3, 7:20 a.m. Move inland immediately. Follow the white tape marking cleared paths through minefields. Mines are active on both sides of the tape. Stay on the marked paths. Assembly area is 300 yards inland behind the first dune line. Regimental commanders will issue further orders at assembly areas. Wave 4, 7:38 a.m. German resistance is light. They weren't expecting us here. We have tactical surprise. Press the advantage. Push inland fast before they can reorganize. Wave 5, 8:02 a.m. Artillery support is now available. Forward observers are with lead elements. Call fire missions through normal channels. Naval gunfire is suppressing German artillery. We have fire superiority. Wave 7, 9:15 a.m. German strongpoint at grid 852419 has been neutralized by naval gunfire. Path to Causeway 2 is clear. Use Causeway 2 as primary route inland. Causeway 1 is under mortar fire. Wave 9, 10:23 a.m. Contact has been established with 82nd Airborne paratroopers inland. They're holding key road junctions. Push inland and link up. Airborne units need immediate reinforcement. Wave 12, 11:47 a.m. Casualty count is light. 47 killed, 183 wounded so far. We're ahead of schedule. Continue inland advance. Objective is Sainte-Mère-Église, 6 miles inland. Wave 15, 1:14 p.m. German counterattack developing from north. 709th Infantry Division elements moving toward beach. Defensive positions are being established. We will hold the beachhead. Wave 17, 2:33 p.m. Counterattack has been repulsed. German forces have withdrawn. We have established secure beachhead 3 miles deep. Continue inland advance toward phase line objectives. Wave 19, 3:47 p.m. Link up with 101st Airborne is complete. Combined forces advancing on Sainte-Mère-Église. Resistance is moderate. We are achieving all D-Day objectives. Wave 21, 4:52 p.m. Engineers have cleared all beach obstacles. Landing craft can now reach the beach at all tide levels. Logistics operations are fully functional. Ammunition and fuel resupply is continuous. Not once in 11 hours did Roosevelt stutter. Not once did he hesitate. Not once did his speech impediment interfere with command. He gave hundreds of verbal orders to thousands of soldiers under continuous German artillery fire. Every order was clear, precise, and immediately understood. At 1:17 p.m., during a particularly heavy German artillery barrage, an 88mm round exploded 15 feet from Roosevelt's position near Causeway 2. The blast threw him to the ground for the second time that day. 3 soldiers nearby were wounded by shrapnel. Roosevelt was covered in sand and debris. Colonel Van Fleet, who'd been following Roosevelt across the beach all morning, ran to him. "General, are you hit?" Van Fleet shouted over the artillery noise. Roosevelt stood up, checked himself for wounds, found none beyond bruises. "I'm fine. Where's the radio? I need to coordinate with the 101st Airborne. They've taken Sainte-Mère-Église but need immediate armor support. Get me 70th Tank Battalion on the radio now." Van Fleet later wrote in his memoirs, "I watched General Roosevelt under the worst conditions I've ever seen. For 11 hours straight, he walked up and down that beach under German artillery fire, giving verbal orders to every unit that landed. I was waiting for the stutter that everyone had warned me about. It never appeared. Not once. His voice was absolutely steady, absolutely clear. I don't know how he did it, but whatever speech impediment he supposedly had, it didn't exist on Utah Beach." Other officers and soldiers who interacted with Roosevelt that day reported the same thing. Staff Sergeant William Bradford, 8th Infantry Regiment, who received direct orders from Roosevelt at 8:30 a.m. "The general walked right up to our platoon, calm as anything, and told us exactly where to go and what to do. His voice was clear, his orders were precise. We'd heard he had some kind of speech problem, but I never heard it. Not once." Lieutenant James McKinney, 22nd Infantry Regiment, who encountered Roosevelt at 2:15 p.m. near Causeway. "General Roosevelt was everywhere. I saw him at least 6 times during the day, always giving orders, always coordinating units, always under fire. He never seemed flustered. He never seemed uncertain. His commands were the clearest I received all day." Captain Robert Garcia, 4th Engineer Special Brigade, who worked with Roosevelt throughout the afternoon clearing beach obstacles. "The general spent hours coordinating our demolition work with incoming landing craft schedules. He must have given us 50 different verbal orders about which obstacles to clear next, where landing craft should beach, how to mark cleared lanes. Never once did he stutter or hesitate. I didn't even know he was supposed to have a speech impediment until someone told me weeks later. By 5:30 p.m., 23 waves had landed. 23,250 men were ashore. Roosevelt had personally directed 23 separate waves. He'd walked the entire 2-mile beach sector at least 3 times. He'd been under continuous German artillery fire for 11 hours. His walking stick was splintered from shrapnel. His uniform was torn in multiple places. His face was covered in sand and cordite residue from exploding shells. But he hadn't stuttered once. Final casualty count for Utah Beach on D-Day, 197 killed, 60 missing, 208 wounded. Total casualties, 465 out of 23,250 men landed. Casualty rate, 2.0%. This was extraordinarily light compared to predictions and compared to other beaches. Omaha Beach, landing simultaneously 12 miles east, suffered approximately 2,400 casualties out of 34,000 men. Casualty rate, 7.1%. Utah Beach casualties were less than one-third the rate at Omaha. Military historians examining D-Day operations have consistently attributed Utah Beach's lower casualties to several factors. The beach was less heavily defended than other sectors. Naval and air bombardment was more effective at Utah than at other beaches. German defenders were surprised by the landing location, and most importantly, leadership on the beach was exceptional from the first moment. That leadership came from Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who made the instant decision to start the war from right here, rather than following doctrine and withdrawing to re-land at the correct beach. That single decision, delivered in 9 clear words without hesitation at 6:33 a.m., saved an estimated 800 American lives. If the division had withdrawn and re-landed 4 to 6 hours later, German reinforcements would have been in position, artillery would have been registered on the beach, and resistance would have been far heavier. But Roosevelt's role wasn't finished at the end of D-Day. For the next 36 days, he continued leading 4th Infantry Division elements across Normandy. The division pushed inland towards Cherbourg, the major port that Allied forces desperately needed for logistics support. Roosevelt coordinated attacks, directed artillery support, reorganized scattered units, and maintained the same clear verbal command that he'd demonstrated on D-Day. On June 14, 1944, 8 days after D-Day, Roosevelt was coordinating the attack on Montebourg, a key town blocking the advance toward Cherbourg. He spent 14 hours under German artillery and mortar fire, giving continuous verbal orders. Medical staff noticed he was showing signs of physical exhaustion. His face was gray. His breathing was labored. He was sweating heavily despite cool weather. These were potential signs of cardiac stress. Medical officers recommended he return to rear areas for rest. Roosevelt refused. "The men are fighting. I'm staying with them." On June 22, 1944, Roosevelt personally led the reconnaissance of German positions around Fort du Roule, the main defensive position protecting Cherbourg. He was under German sniper fire for 6 hours. One bullet hit a wall 3 feet from his head. He never stopped giving orders, never stopped directing troops, never showed any speech impediment. On June 26, 1944, Cherbourg fell to Allied forces. The port, though heavily damaged by German demolitions, would eventually become the main logistics hub for Allied armies in France. Roosevelt had been instrumental in the campaign. General Barton wrote in his report, "Brigadier General Roosevelt's leadership during the Cherbourg campaign was exceptional. His personal courage and clear command were decisive factors in our success." But the 36 days of continuous combat were taking a severe physical toll. Roosevelt's heart condition, diagnosed as severe arteriosclerotic heart disease before D-Day, was worsening under the stress. On July 11, 1944, Roosevelt complained of chest pains and shortness of breath. Medical officers examined him. They found irregular heartbeat, elevated blood pressure, and signs of heart failure. They ordered him to evacuate to a field hospital immediately. Roosevelt refused. "I'm not leaving my division." At 10:15 p.m. on July 12, 1944, in his tent near Sainte-Mère-Église, 36 days after landing on Utah Beach, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. died of a massive heart attack. He was 56 years old. Medical examiners determined the cause: acute myocardial infarction due to severe arteriosclerotic heart disease, exacerbated by 36 days of physical and emotional stress during combat operations. General Barton wrote to Roosevelt's widow, Eleanor, "Ted's death is a tremendous loss to the division and to the Army. He was the finest combat leader I've ever known. He led from the front, shared every hardship with his men, and never asked anyone to do anything he wouldn't do himself. His courage was an inspiration to every soldier who saw him. We will miss him terribly." General Eisenhower wrote, "The death of General Roosevelt is a loss to the Allied cause. His leadership on Utah Beach may have saved thousands of lives. His decision to improvise the landing plan when we landed at the wrong beach was one of the finest examples of combat leadership in this war. But perhaps the most meaningful tributes came from the soldiers who served under him. Private First Class Thomas Anderson, who landed in the second wave on Utah Beach. I saw General Roosevelt standing at the waterline giving orders when we landed. He looked like somebody's grandfather with that walking stick, but his voice was strong and clear. He told us exactly what to do. We followed him inland because we knew he knew what he was doing. When I heard he died a month later, I cried. He saved my life on that beach. Staff Sergeant Charles Williams, 8th Infantry Regiment. General Roosevelt was with us every day after D-Day. He was always at the front, always giving orders, always encouraging us. I never once heard him stutter or hesitate. Whatever speech problem he supposedly had, it never showed in combat. He was the best officer I ever served under. On September 28, 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt presented the Medal of Honor posthumously to Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s widow at a ceremony in Washington, D.C. The citation read, "For gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty on 6 June 1944 in France." After 2 verbal requests to accompany the leading assault elements in the Normandy invasion had been denied, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. renewed his request in writing. Although he was fully aware that the enemy had the beach under constant surveillance and that its defenses included concrete gun emplacements, machine gun nests, land mines, and other obstacles, General Roosevelt was one of the first soldiers ashore. He repeatedly led groups from the beach over the seawall and established them inland. His valor, courage, and presence in the very front of the attack, and his complete unconcern at being under heavy fire, inspired the troops to heights of enthusiasm and self-sacrifice. Although the enemy had the beach under constant direct fire, General Roosevelt moved from one locality to another, rallying men around him, directed and personally led them against the enemy. Under his seasoned, precise, calm, and unfaltering leadership, assault troops reduced beach strong points and rapidly moved inland with minimum casualties. He thus contributed substantially to the successful establishment of the beachhead in France. The citation didn't mention his stutter. The citation didn't mention that Army medical boards had declared him unfit for command 3 separate times. The citation didn't mention that evaluators had failed him twice in officer candidate school because they believed his speech impediment made him unsuitable for leadership. The citation didn't mention that he'd spent 25 years being told he couldn't command troops under stress because his stutter would fail him at critical moments. But the 250 men who landed on Utah Beach on June 6, 1944, knew. They knew that a 56-year-old general with a documented speech impediment had stood on that beach under German artillery fire for 11 hours and never stuttered once. They knew that his 9 words, "We'll start the war from right here," had changed the entire invasion plan and saved hundreds of lives. They knew that for 36 days after D-Day, he'd continued leading from the front without ever showing the speech defect that was supposed to disqualify him from command. Post-war analysis by speech pathologists and military psychologists attempted to explain Roosevelt's performance. Some theories suggested that adrenaline and stress hormones suppressed the stuttering mechanism. Other theories proposed that his extensive preparation created automatic verbal responses that bypassed the neurological pathways causing stutters. Some suggested that the weight of responsibility overrode his brain's tendency to block speech. None of the theories fully explained how a man with severe developmental stuttering documented over 37 years could perform flawlessly under the most extreme stress in military history. Perhaps the answer is simpler. Perhaps the medical boards were wrong. Perhaps Roosevelt's stutter wasn't a command liability. Perhaps it had always been a misdiagnosis of what actually mattered in leadership. Perhaps the evaluators who failed him in 1917 were measuring the wrong thing. Perhaps clear speech under routine conditions isn't the same as clear speech under combat conditions. Perhaps stress affects different people's speech patterns in different ways. Or perhaps Roosevelt simply refused to let his stutter define what he could accomplish. Perhaps he spent 37 years preparing, practicing, and memorizing so thoroughly that when the critical moment came, he was ready. Perhaps that's what leadership actually is. Not natural talent, not physical perfection, not absence of impairments, but preparation so thorough that when the moment demands action, you're ready regardless of your limitations. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was buried at the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial in Colleville-sur-Mer, France, on July 14, 1944. His grave is in Plot 45, Row 27, 200 yards from Utah Beach. On clear days, visitors to his grave can hear the sound of waves on the beach where he landed on D-Day. His grave marker reads, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., United States Army, Medal of Honor, 1887-1944. Nothing about his stutter, nothing about the medical boards who declared him unfit, nothing about the evaluators who failed him, just his rank, his medal, and the years he lived. In 1955, the French government erected a monument at Utah Beach, commemorating the American units that landed on June 6, 1944. At the top of the monument's inscription is a single name, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Assistant Division Commander, 4th Infantry Division, First General Officer to land with Assault Troops, Medal of Honor. The monument is positioned exactly where Roosevelt made his famous decision to start the war, from right here. In 1960, the United States Army established the Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Award, given annually to the Army officer who best exemplifies leadership under adverse conditions. The award citation specifically mentions Roosevelt's service on D-Day and his ability to lead effectively despite physical limitations and institutional barriers. In 56 years since the award's establishment, it has been given to 56 officers. Several have been combat wounded, several have had physical disabilities, several have overcome institutional discrimination. All have demonstrated that physical perfection isn't a requirement for exceptional leadership. In 2019, speech pathologists at the American Speech-Language Hearing Association published a retrospective analysis of Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s military service records. Their conclusion: Roosevelt's case demonstrates that developmental stuttering, even when severe, does not necessarily impair verbal communication under high-stress conditions. The assumption that stuttering is incompatible with combat leadership appears to be incorrect based on available evidence. Modern military evaluation procedures should reassess the criteria used to determine leadership fitness in candidates with speech impediments. That analysis came 75 years too late for Roosevelt, who died believing he had to prove himself every single day, who requested combat assignment 11 times before being accepted, who wrote 6 separate requests to land on D-Day before being approved, who promised to resign if he stuttered once under fire. He never had to resign. He never stuttered once in combat, not on Utah Beach, not during the 36 days after D-Day, not during World War I. The speech impediment that was supposed to disqualify him from leadership never manifested when leadership actually mattered. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. proved that the medical boards were wrong, that the evaluators were wrong, that institutional assumptions about what makes a good leader were wrong. He proved that a 56-year-old man with a walking stick, a heart condition, and a lifetime of stuttering could lead 10,000 men through the largest amphibious invasion in history without hesitating once. That's the story of Theodore Roosevelt Jr. and the day he started the war from Utah Beach. That's the story of a man who spent 37 years being told he couldn't lead because of how he spoke, then led 23,250 men to victory while speaking with perfect clarity. That's the story of unlikely heroes who prove that our assumptions about limitations are often more limiting than the limitations themselves. If stories like this remind you why we preserve history, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel for more forgotten heroes who changed history despite being told they couldn't. Turn on that notification bell so you never miss these stories. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if anyone in your family served on D-Day. Tell us if you know other heroes who overcame disabilities or discrimination to accomplish extraordinary things. We read every single comment because these stories matter, these heroes deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make sure they never disappear into silence. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.